Hi, I'm Brian Lee Crowley, Managing Director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, here to talk to you about the size of government in Canada. We can't talk sensibly about how big it should be until we know how big it is, and it's a lot bigger than we think. It's natural to think the size of government is how much of our money government takes and decides what to do with instead of us deciding. So people tend to compare the amount of spending in government budgets to the size of our economy, our GDP. You can add up federal, provincial, and municipal budgets, or just say, look only at the federal government. Compare what it spends now to 25 years ago, or contrast various provincial governments, all relative to GDP, and start drawing your own conclusions about just how big government is. But not so fast. GDP is a pretty good measure of the economy and its growth over time. But government spending doesn't tell us nearly enough about how the state influences our lives. There are all kinds of ways that government makes decisions for us that don't involve taking our money and spending it. And recently, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute commissioned studies on just two of these. One is using taxes to reward behavior that governments like. These so-called tax expenditures are in fact spending, disguised as tax cuts. The other is regulations intended to manipulate prices and production in specific industries rather than to create sensible ground rules for everyone. It's one thing to have rules about, say, food, and quite another intentionally to raise the price Canadians pay for milk or eggs. There are other kinds of hidden government intervention, of course, but between them, these two alone make the state in Canada nearly half as big again as it seems. And both are not just big, they're growing. As governments want to seem frugal to citizens, but haven't given up their sweeping ambitions to affect our lives. It's important to get a handle on these additional areas of government intervention to see how they change over time, and also for purposes of holding the government to account. We've been fighting against taxation without representation since Magna Carta. But where's the accountability on regulations or on tax expenditures? Start with what are formally known as tax expenditures, but we're going to call what they really are tax breaks. In a 2014 paper for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Muneer Sheikh, former Chief Statistician of Canada, studied these programs in which basically the government takes money in taxes, then sends you some if you invest in a particular industry, enroll your child in arts class, buy a transit pass, or whatever the government wants to encourage, but calls it a tax rebate instead of spending. They have exactly the same effect as spending. You wind up better off than other people because you did something the government likes. Governments claim that they're cutting taxes or putting money back into citizens' pockets. But a real tax cut means income, corporate, or sales taxes go down for everyone. With tax breaks, some people get money back only because tax rates are higher for everyone else. Meanwhile, governments get to send checks to taxpayers and look smaller and more frugal. A lot smaller, according to Muneer Sheikh.
In 2009, the last year for which appropriate data for this type of analysis are available, the federal government took in and spent 7.4% more of GDP than it seemed to thanks to these tax expenditures. That is over $113 billion and means the federal government is half again as big as it says, and crucially, has not been shrinking slowly since 2000 as it claims. Provincial tax breaks add another 4.3% of GDP. And because of some overlap, the cumulative figure is just over 10%. That is over $154 billion a year and means our governments control 10 more cents of every dollar than the published data show.
It's a big number, but we're not done. There's also the big and growing impact of regulation. Of course, everything and everyone is in some sense regulated, for instance, for health or safety purposes. But like taxes, not all regulations are created equal. There's a huge difference, for example, between a regulation to prevent everyone from drowning or to keep fake labels off tins, and one that tries to make people invest in solar energy instead of oil, or vice versa. And while it can be hard to tell one type from the other, especially given how many there are, a second paper for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute by Philip Cross, a senior fellow at the Institute, and before that chief economic analyst at Statistics Canada, focused on those regulations that clearly aim to control prices or production in a specific industry.
For instance, agricultural supply management intentionally transfers huge sums from people who drink milk or eat eggs to people who produce them. If governments taxed us and wrote checks to farmers, we would see it clearly as a major, deliberate transfer of wealth. Just because government does it stealthily and indirectly doesn't make it any smaller or less deliberate. Supply management costs the average family over $400 a year and nearly $600 for those with children, and imposes an implicit tax of nearly 2.5% on the poorest families. It basically doubles the price of milk compared to the United States, and again, the poor suffer the most. Regulations that deliberately reduce competition to drive up prices are concentrated in 4 sectors of the economy: utilities, agriculture, finance, and communications. And I estimate they raise the footprint of government by at least another 10.5% of GDP. Add that to Shake's 10% and you get over 20% more of the economy in the hands of government than the standard measures suggest.
That means government in Canada is half again as big as it claims and decides how 20 more cents of every dollar is spent than it says it does. This discovery doesn't settle whether government is too big or whether any given policy makes sense. But it does tell us we're paying far more for government than we think we are. And that's well worth knowing. For more details, please visit www.macdonaldlaurier.ca and download the papers. And thank you for joining us for this discussion.